Before we get into the meat of today's video, I wanted to update everyone on what I was talking about in yesterday's video, where since that has happened, Boris Johnson and David Davis resigning, some vice chair aides have resigned and other people from cabinet positions, to the point where only Angela Merkel herself is praising Theresa May for making progress and that the deal is 80% done, because right now what we want to show unity are two of the weakest leaders in the Western world, i.e. Theresa May and Angela Merkel, praising each other. And I'm not joking. Angela Merkel or Angela Merkel, whichever way you want to pronounce it, is hanging on by a thread. She will not win her next term, that is a guarantee. For God's sake, how many coalitions did she have to form for this government? And Theresa May, if she pushes with this idea, is done. We know this, as much like everyone suspected, there were already letters submitting for a vote of no confidence. Not that I see that ending well just yet, for people that want her out, that is. But give it time, I'm sure things will turn around. Now the subject of today's video are from subjects that have actually cropped up in the past, but have since been updated. For example, the police force are being asked to consider the case for monitoring sexist abuse. Now this all stems back to July of 2016, where Nottinghamshire police began to trial a scheme where wolf whistling would be considered misogyny, and by extension, a hate crime. Now I know what most of you think. What an absolute waste of money. It's wolf whistling. And these studies have been done multiple times, with a woman walking through a city and only being noticed or addressed in a somewhat misogynistic manner a couple of times over the many hours that she walked around New York City. And then you had a man, a very attractive man, and he was the victim, and I call him victim because if we're going to be consistent here, then of course it was sexist for them to then treat him like an object, the women that catcalled him. So if we're going to be consistent here, then surely we want to focus on both victims. As Henry Cavill himself has said, men can be victims of this. Not that I care too much for the idea of a victim from the offset. This is all quite frankly pointless and a waste of resources. There are things the police could actually be dealing with, and this is not on the list. It's not even in the top 100 things the police should be doing. So I hope I've made my point quite clear. But in any case, we have two articles from two different things that have come up, and I want to address both in this video because I think this all falls under the bracket of let's just attack men because, which will all lead to an inevitable. If you keep pushing men, alienating men, taking away powers and rights from men, making them feel like they are the perpetrator at all costs, eventually there is a pushback, and the pushback is always the one you don't want. It is not a threat. To be clear, I do not condone violence, but I know eventually, when you push someone hard enough, they either absolutely surrender, or they fight. So it's flight or fight. Although flight in this instance will be accompanied by a white flag. Although moving away entirely actually is not such a bad idea either. I guess there are three options. Flight, fight, be French. That works. Flight, fight, French. I like that. So, police chiefs are looking at recording misogyny as a hate crime, including incidents of men whistling at women. Include it the other way round and we can talk. Although I will say whistling is quite cool. Forces are being asked to consider the case for monitoring sexist abuse and harassment. Well, if you're going to be consistent, the above statement needs to be reflective of both genders being the victim of the wolf whistling, as it does in fact happen. It means misogyny. How about just sexism, because misogyny is only one particular way, and if we're going to truly tackle sexism in all its forms, you have to accept that both men and women can be victims of sexism. We know this is the case because we still have systems in place that protect women and not men, that give women rights that men do not have, that make it so that men do not have access to services because they are always considered the perpetrator. Do I have to be any more obvious? If agreed, abuse directed at women could be treated more seriously than comparable crimes against men, and could even lead to tougher sentences in the courts. I'm going to leave that in. This is what most people have considered to be over years, to be women being treated as if they are a protected class. This reinforces it. This is also a contributing factor in what others call, and I have said it so many damn times, the sentencing gap. Quite frankly, This is not a deterrent. This is elitist. This is actually sexist. By the very definition of the thing you are trying to tackle, it is sexist. Because you have elevated women above men and treated men as less than human. You are denying them equal rights, and I would argue that anyone who is given a severe sentence compared to what a woman would receive then has a right to push for a motion to dismiss on the grounds of discrimination. Whether or not they are successful or not, I'm not entirely sure. But if you start to gender laws like this, you run a very serious risk. And I'm pretty sure most of you, my audience, would agree with me. And I know I've said this many times, but if you are a law person and now want to inject yourself in here, go right ahead. I'll just make it a point to ignore your comment once I realise there's a level of snark in it. I do read the comments after all. Nottinghamshire Police began trialling the scheme in 2016 and were followed by a handful of other forces. Now recording misogyny as a hate crime could be rolled out across all 43 forces in England and Wales, with a spokesperson saying police forces in England and Wales annually monitor 5 strands of hate crime. Police chiefs will be presented with a paper and asks them to consider the case for monitoring gender-based hate crime in the same way, only if it is absolutely equal monitoring and not exclusively looking for men as the perpetrator. There are instances we have seen with helplines that intentionally label men as the perpetrator, even though the service should be available to them as victim. Hell, last week in PMQs, an MP stood up and actually said 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence and 1 in 4 men are victims of domestic violence. That is the first time I have ever heard it ever recognised that men are equally the victims of domestic violence in the United Kingdom, and I am going to play this clip now.
Domestic abuse is an act of brutality, often hidden in plain sight, and it affects 1 in 4 women and 1 in 4 men across this country.
Because it is quite important, recognising something that is absolutely abhorrent, and understanding and accepting that men are victims as well, because if you noticed, there was no laughter when men were mentioned as victims. That is a first. The only other times I've heard domestic violence mentioned were when SNP members stood up and asked questions, but explicitly mentioned women only as the victim. And this is important. This is one of those cases where you must accept both genders can be affected by this. Notice how I said gender, not sex, because I've yet to see any legitimate statistics on non-binary victims of domestic violence. Anyway, the article continues on talking about women's centres and the End Violence Against Women Coalition, and pointing out that in forces that record misogyny as a hate crime, culprits are investigated and specially trained officers offer support to the victim. Fantastic. Now what about sexism as a whole? Just saying, I think this is one of those cases where you have to accept and address it as a whole, and perhaps correlate it and base it on statistics that show, and perhaps maybe instead outlaw whistling. Maybe do that. Have it replaced with a vuvuzela if you really want to get that girl's attention that she has one slamming hot booty. I feel like I'm the wrong person to say booty. Booty, booty, booty. I need a drink. Yeah. Tennessee honey. The second article I wanted to cover was again something that had cropped up a few years ago, but has since resurfaced. The article title, A Curfew for Men? What a great idea! And that's not even sarcasm. Imagine my shock. Thank you, Melinda Houston. So, Gretel, oh my god, that's actually a name, Lamont's recent letter in these pages, no men allowed out after dark. What a totally awesome idea. I have quite generally been racking my brain as to what we can realistically do to ensure women's safety after dark. It's possible I missed a speech quotation thing and just carried on with it. Demanding safe passage at all hours, regardless of where we are, what we're wearing, or our blood alcohol level is all very well. But that is never going to happen no matter how much education there is. There is always going to be random evil dudes out there. Yes, there is. What's your point? So how do we shift responsibility of women's safety from the victims to the perpetrators? I don't know, stick bromine in their tea? Although I would say that the responsibility is to both people to obey the law. For women, of course, you want to stay safe. And of course, at the same time, you don't want to have to then go out of your way to protect yourself because you shouldn't have to do that. I agree. I totally agree. Much like those evil dickheads that then rape poor innocent people on the way home. men and women I might add, but mostly women of course, the statistics do in fact show this. We need to be able to understand why these men do this, why they are so opportunistic, and why they think they can get away with committing a truly heinous crime, and why we have yet to have a guillotine introduced just for those people, for their cocks. I mean, if they're so willing to stick it in something without consent, then surely they won't mind sliding it into a guillotine. I'm kidding, I'm not encouraging violence here. I maintain if you're convicted of rape and it's 100% proven, you, male or female, belong in a jail for the rest of your life. I'm not convinced rehabilitation will help you, and certainly there are studies that would conclude that rehabilitation doesn't work on certain crimes. Adding her bit to the debate, and in response to the suggestion from yet another letter writer that women shouldn't walk alone at night, which I disagree with, Miss Lamont came up with perhaps the most practical and efficient solution yet: a curfew on men. Genius! I think to guarantee absolutely no one suffers, I believe in a curfew on everyone. What, is that unpopular? I'm kidding, I don't actually believe this. I don't for a second think anyone should have a curfew unless they've broken the law and it is imposed upon them by a court, or you are a child and your parents do not wish for you to be out past a certain time. That said, the idea of putting a curfew on men means that then businesses suffer. That is true. We know this. And I will not now be going into the vastly complex understanding of why some people commit those crimes. The simple solution is because they're a cunt. We all know that. But as we all know, there are many different scenarios that play out that lead to that idiot committing that crime, which is why that idiot, regardless of intoxication or culture, religion, belong in a jail for a very long time, preferably with their genitals removed, male or female. Remember the woman from last week who forced her boyfriend to, quote, have sex with her? Yeah. Castrate her. So now let's hear the genius reasons as to this curfew on men. There are a number of options. One is to simply ban all men from being on the streets or on public transport after, say, 9:30 p.m, which is effectively the restriction currently placed on women. Self-imposed, and of course entirely based on the inability of the police to tackle certain crimes and make it such a fear factor for those who intend to commit a crime that they are unwilling to commit crimes, for example, in cities. We know this as the crime rate in London is astronomical and the police are pathetic. They're too busy chasing misogyny. I'm kidding, they're not busy chasing misogyny. They're too busy mimicking their American friends and eating donuts. And you think I'm joking? They are, because they're fucking useless. Oh, and omitting evidence, not fully investigating, and generally not doing their job properly. Of course, in our country we have our own issues with the police investigating rape and believing word verbatim what someone has said, and then compiling the evidence and withholding some of it to the point where it has been found on the final day, and the truly innocent person, the original perpetrator, is found to be not guilty, and I hope they sue you into the ground. Anyway, the remainder of the article gives a bunch of scenarios and replacements to encourage men to not be on the streets so women have a safe journey home. As I've stated, this is entirely based on cities. This does not take into account rural or suburban areas and different cultural changes, because let's face it, even my country, which is the size of the average American backyard, has several different cultures and subcultures within it. Hundreds of cultures, different views and perceptions on how society should run. I would not for a second want to be out late in London, not just because of the knife crime. And I say London loosely because London is vast, and there are so many different cultures within it. There are some I would not go through during the day, and that's just Westminster, because then I'd see all those corrupt oiks. You know, the politicians. If you don't know what an oik is, please Google it. It's appropriate. Anyway, all this sexist nonsense is doing my head in, so I'm going to end this now. So I hope everyone has a lovely Wednesday, and if anyone's interested, by the way, PMQs might be on today. Hopefully Theresa May gets fucking flayed, you traitor. And thank you all for listening.
Oh, goddowns.
In your arse.
Imagine my shock